on this Saturday night, earthquake devastation. Horror on the streets of Morocco.
We're going backwards and forwards and everything started moving.
The rescue mission, the casualties, and one Canadian's tense story of survival from the disaster zone.
It was really, really scary.
Startling consensus. The softening stance against Russia's invasion on day one of the G20. Shooting for a culture change as Hockey Canada aims to carve out toxic masculinity.
I just look at history and it continues to repeat itself.
Why one ex-NHLer isn't buying it.
Global National with Farah Nasser.
Panic and disbelief on the streets of central Morocco in the immediate aftermath of a powerful earthquake, the strongest to hit the country in 120 years. More than 2,000 people have been killed and more than 2,000 others have been injured. Most of them are in critical condition. There are fears the number of dead will grow. The 6.8 magnitude quake struck Morocco's high Atlas Mountains and flattened historic buildings in Marrakech, the city closest to the earthquake's epicenter. Roads are impassable, meaning it could take days to reach some of the hardest hit villages in Morocco's remote mountainous region. Tonight, Caryn Lieberman on the death and the devastation.
Rescue workers comb through the rubble in a race against the clock as they struggle to reach the hardest hit, most remote areas of Morocco. A powerful earthquake destroyed buildings and crumpled homes across much of the country. We were harmed in the old city. We were harmed by the earthquake, said this local resident. Everything is God's will, but we sustained great harm. With widespread destruction in ancient cities and mountain villages, the military and emergency services are scrambling to find survivors who could be trapped under piles of debris.
We was going backwards and forwards and everything started moving and pictures started moving, and so we just grabbed some clothes and our bags and we raced out.
Canadians in Morocco are urged to register with Global Affairs Canada, and in Toronto, disaster relief charity Global Medic is already sending urgently needed aid.
We've offered to deploy a drone team. That would be civilian operators, pilots, small drones, support search and rescue activities. Second, we've offered family emergency kits, which you can see the volunteers behind me are packing and making right now.
Saving lives is the priority, with many still feared to be trapped under the rubble. But preserving Marrakech is also meaningful for teams on the ground. It's home to a number of UNESCO World Heritage sites, including the famous Red Walls, partially damaged.
There are parts of town which are destroyed. That car is completely destroyed and the buildings are falling down.
Bonavista, Newfoundland Mayor John Norman was attending a UNESCO conference and had just arrived back from the city's historic Medina when the shaking began.
The hotel ceiling is cracking. The light fixtures were falling from the ceiling. Sirens, ambulances, bodies being removed. It's quite something.
Fearing aftershocks, people will spend another night in the streets as the North African nation begins one of the biggest recovery efforts in its history. Caryn Lieberman, Global News.
As you just heard, the tremor is the strongest to hit the country in more than a century. And there is a huge push to get aid flowing into Morocco and mobilize what will need to be a massive humanitarian response. Canada's largest Moroccan population lives in the city of Montreal. And today, relatives of those caught up in the chaos spoke about their fears and their hopes for their loved ones. Gloria Henriquez reports.
At this Moroccan cafe in Montreal, Saturday mornings are for soccer, but news of the tragic earthquake back home is all these Montrealers can think about. It's a black Saturday, says Mousli Yassine. The first thing he did when he heard about the earthquake was call his family in Casablanca. They were shocked and surprised, he said. They slept on the streets, fearing an afterquake. Adil Boumaiz, originally from Rabat, says he stayed up all night watching the news. There's a feeling of helplessness being so far, he says. The earthquake shook Marrakech, where Montreal City Councillor Serge Sacheville was vacationing.
And I thought that someone was taking a carpet under my feet because it was like there was no ground under my feet. It was really, really scary.
With such a large Moroccan population, local politicians took to social media to react to the news. Montreal Mayor Valérie Plante saying in part, "The images from Morocco break our hearts. My thoughts are with the Montreal community of Moroccan origin." Quebec Premier François Legault echoing her thoughts, adding that he's visited several magnificent cities in the country. At this Moroccan butcher shop located in an area of Montreal called Little Maghreb, Kantari Youssef says the local Arabic community at large is banding together to get through the tragedy. We will soon start collecting donations, he said. Back at Amistad Café, as Yassine sees the death toll mount by the hour. He says he's hoping the nightmare ends soon. Gloria Henriquez, Global News, Montreal.
During the opening session of the G20 meeting in India, the host country's Prime Minister Narendra Modi offered his condolences to those affected by the deadly earthquake, saying the global community is with them and ready to help. On day one of the summit, the leaders, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, reached a consensus on the war in Ukraine, calling for peace. But as Caryn Lieberman reports, Ukraine's foreign ministry is criticizing the declaration because it does not directly mention Russia.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is determined to put his country's best face forward. And that includes a plan to keep some things out of sight. The authorities asked us to leave, she says, because of the G20. Bulldozing slums and bolstering security. Modi has staked his reputation on the summit going off smoothly, even if some of his measures are controversial.
This really is India's moment in many respects, not just the G20, but the lead up to the G20 over the past year with several ministerial engagements, the B20 meetings, the lunar landing.
The Indian Prime Minister is trying to propel his country as a rising superpower and a counterweight to China, whose leader Xi Jinping skipped the meeting.
Mr. Modi will come out of the summit as the leader of the Global South, which will do a lot for the developing countries, for development, and it'll all be done without Mr. Xi here, so he can't claim any credit for it at all.
There were doubts the G20 countries with differing views could come to a consensus on the war in Ukraine. India has taken a neutral stance in the conflict.
G20 लीडर समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है.
A compromise was reached earlier than expected, but the joint statement appeared to have a softer tone, with no explicit mention of Moscow's aggression or a Russian withdrawal from Ukraine, outlined in the communique from the last G20 summit in Bali.
Bali was Bali and New Delhi is New Delhi. I mean, Bali was a year ago, the context, the situation was different.
Senior government sources with knowledge of the negotiations say Canada wanted to see stronger language in the Delhi Declaration. But they insist that at the G20, it's always a give and take.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will meet with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Sunday, the last day of the summit. Ukraine, which was not invited to the G20, has slammed the declaration, saying it's nothing to be proud of. Farah?
Caryn Lieberman in Delhi. Thank you. The war in Ukraine has triggered a sharp rise in the number of people killed or injured by cluster munitions. An annual report funded in part by the Canadian government found there was almost an 8-fold increase in cluster bomb casualties last year. And as Redmond Shannon reports, those figures don't even include this year's controversial shipment of weapons to Ukraine from the United States.
When the United States said in July it was sending cluster munitions to help Ukraine, even Kyiv's closest allies, including Canada and Germany, were critical of the move. Human rights groups outraged.
We were appalled by that decision. We fought it behind the scenes for the year leading up.
Canada is among the 112 countries that prohibit the use, production and export of cluster munitions. But the US, Russia and Ukraine have not adopted the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions. It means the use of the devastating weapon is widespread in Russia's invasion. The Cluster Munition Coalition's annual report says the number of known casualties in cluster attacks went from 0 in 2021 before the war to almost 1,000 last year, the vast majority civilians, most in Ukraine. The coalition also recorded cluster casualties blamed on government forces in Syria and Myanmar.
The vast majority of the cluster munition attacks in Ukraine during 2022 and into 2023 have been conducted by Russian forces. However, it's clear that Ukrainian forces have also used cluster munitions, causing civilian harm.
Ukraine and Russia deny using cluster bombs near civilians. The weapons are also lethal because of the unexploded mini-bombs left behind. Casualties from those events rose by 1/4 last year. Most were in Yemen and Iraq, 71 of them children.
These remnants are particularly devastating to children. They're interesting. They are often in areas where children play.
The total casualty figure is the highest since the first report in 2010. The data was compiled before Washington's delivery to Kyiv.
The greatest obstacle to countries working to eradicate cluster munitions are the governments that are unwilling to join this convention.
The report also calls for quicker clearance programs for cluster remnants. Alongside clearing landmines, that will be a huge task in Ukraine, one that is growing by the day. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Conservative convention coming up. The federal opposition picks its policy priorities ahead of the next election. As the Conservatives ride a wave of support from opinion polls, the party wrapped up what's likely its only policy convention before the next federal election. The gathering in Quebec City attracted a record number of more than 2,500 delegates. And they now have recommended a diverse set of policy proposals they want their party to campaign on. Our David Aiken looks at what's being proposed.
Let's bring it home!
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre fired up delegates Friday night with an hour-long campaign-style speech. And on Saturday, the delegates got down to the hard work of picking the policy priorities they want Poilievre to campaign on. This convention started with 60 policy proposals, but half of those failed to make the final cut. Among those that passed, Conservatives want a foreign policy that is tougher on China, an expansion of rail infrastructure, including high-speed passenger rail, ramp up investments in clean technology while supporting oil and gas production.
We value environment, economy, and our health. It's about jobs and balance. That's what Canadians want and need. Thank you.
Our energy transition policy highlights how the federal government can work with local communities to meet the future energy needs of Canadians.
Prohibit discrimination based on vaccine status. Ban minors and those with mental illness from medical assistance in dying, and ban gender-affirming medical treatment for minors.
This is not just a federal or a provincial or municipal issue. It's around the world. We need to stand up for kids.
Among those policies that failed, Conservatives rejected a call to defund the CBC and its French-language service Radio-Canada. That's because such a policy could have hurt the Conservatives here in Quebec, where RadCan is seen as an important cultural voice. But under the party's rules, it is the leader, Pierre Poilievre, who has the final say on what policies will be in his platform. He can reject some that were approved this weekend or bring back some that failed. And there were some grassroots Conservatives here that thought that gives the leader too much power, and they had put forward a proposal to change that. But that proposal failed.
So what will be in the next Conservative election platform? Well, we'll likely have to wait a couple of years to find out until the next election, and it's an election not likely to take place until the fall of 2025. Farah.
David Aiken in Quebec City. Thank you, David. Executives at Hockey Canada have spent the past 2 days in meetings in Calgary trying to make the sport more safe and more inclusive. But just last week, a former NHL coach who was fired for making racist comments was rehired. Bill Peters was named head coach of the Lethbridge Hurricanes junior hockey team and apologized to the victim he used racial slurs against, former NHLer Akeem Aliu.
To Akeem,
Excuse me. I apologize. I now recognize the impact of my words. I was uneducated in my use of inappropriate language. I failed to create a safe place for Akeem, and I'm deeply sorry.
It's been more than a decade since the comments were made and more than 4 years since Akeem Aliu came forward with these allegations. Aliu is no longer playing professional hockey, but he is involved in trying to bring diversity to the game. I had a chance to sit down with him earlier this week. Akeem, thanks so much for joining us. First, let's start with that apology. What's your reaction to it?
I mean, it was something that was very difficult to see. Obviously, the emotion that was displayed doesn't really correlate with the outreach towards the victims, which is myself, and obviously the stories with Mikel Jordan as well. I think when you're that sorry about something that happened so long ago, I think the first thing that you got to do is get in contact with the victim and to understand where they're at and how they feel about it. So I hope he was sincere in his words and his emotion, but I always look at the action behind it. I haven't heard anything from him in 13 years and 4 years since it's become public. At the end of the day, I hope that this is a teaching moment for a lot of people, and we move on in a positive light from here.
Do you think speaking out hurt your hockey career?
100%. I didn't say anything for close to 9 years because I was scared of what that was going to do to my career, and it's actually proven to be right. And I was in the middle of still playing when I went public in 2019, and ever since then it's been really difficult to get opportunities to get on the ice and get a fair shot. To have one person be able to take that away from you, and I use it as a tool to support my family in so many ways just because of our financial shortcomings, and for somebody to come and take it away and is really difficult, and it's something that I'll battle with for the rest of my life. That's for sure.
Hockey Canada is holding a summit this weekend, and they're looking at the issue of toxic masculinity, but also the issues of racism. I think trying to kind of clean up the image that Hockey Canada's had for several years now. Do you think that's going to make a difference or a dent?
I just look at history, and it continues to repeat itself in the game of hockey. Obviously, the way they handled the 2018 sexual allegations was very difficult to see, and just how far they dug their heels in. And it took public outcry to be able to see change within the board and at the CEO level. You look at all the steps taken backwards by the NHL with inclusion nights and stripping people of that 15 minutes of being able to show that it's a welcoming and inclusive space. I think getting the right people in the room is more important than anything. At the end of the day, we still have mostly white folks running these establishments, and I think to talk about toxic masculinity and their issues of racism and misogyny in the game, you need to have people around that have actually dealt with those issues.
You're doing some incredible work on the ground with the Hockey Diversity Alliance. You're working with kids just starting their hockey journey in the minors. We know that race-based incidents still exist. There's data to back that up. But what kind of incidents are we still seeing today?
It's so sad. If you only saw the kind of the inboxes, the reach out to our inboxes we get of racial issues, and I mean it's 2, 3, 4 times a week, all over Canada, all over North America. Kids saying they've been called the N-word, Indigenous kids not being welcome, Asian kids being made fun of. When you reach out to these organizations and we talk about having a very strict policy, it takes a long time to get anything done. If a kid doesn't feel included in the game, it doesn't matter the talent level or the passion they have towards the game, it's something that they don't want to continue doing. It's very difficult to explain that to a 10-year-old that, you know, things will get better and you do have support. It's things that I've dealt with, things other guys in the HDA have been going through for their whole lives. Hockey has become a very elite and very white sport, and it's only getting worse. And money is kind of the ruler of hockey. We're trying to show kids that the game can be inclusive, and that's what we're doing with the HDA grassroots program, and we're having a lot of success.
You just said it's getting worse. Why is it getting worse? I would think it would be getting better with all that we know now.
It's getting worse because hockey is getting more and more expensive. When I played AAA hockey, of course, it was 15 years ago, but we were paying $3,000 as a family to play AAA hockey. Now we're getting upwards to $10,000 to play the game of hockey. So it excludes a large demographic from the game right away. So the work that we're trying to do is trying to close that gap and open it up to more people. And I don't understand why the establishment continues to push back on it, because it'll make the sport better.
If you had a kid, knowing what you know now about hockey culture.
I just had a kid 2 months ago.
You just had a kid?
2 months ago, yes.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
Knowing what you know now, would you encourage him to get into hockey?
It's such a hard question. Part of me says yes. I do want him to reap the benefits of playing in a more inclusive space, and I hope it gets better. And in other ways, and this makes me extremely sad as well, I don't want him to deal with what I went through. His mom doesn't want him to deal with what I went through. But at the end of the day, I love hockey with a passion. It was my first love. It's always going to be my true love. And I hope we can get the game to a space where all kids, including my son, can feel loved in the game and pursue it and make it the greatest game in the world, because I do think it has that potential.
Okay, Akeem, thanks so much for your time and your passion.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you having me.
Next, dealing with devastation, heartbreaking scenes from Morocco. Morocco has a long road to recovery after last night's devastating earthquake. So many are in mourning. We leave you tonight with heartbreaking scenes and harrowing stories of what unfolded there. This is Global National for Saturday night. I'm Farah Nasser. Take care of yourselves and have a good night.
The country's in a certain amount of panic. People really don't know what to do. A couple of walls inside my house collapsed while I was sleeping, which was pretty terrifying. I can tell you, to wake up to that. There's a certain surreal experience waking up to an earthquake. But you know, I think my worries and my heart goes out to people living in traditional homes or even houses that were poorly built.
We're getting mixed pictures. There's no official guidance coming from anywhere that we've received. We don't know what to do next. A lot of people slept on the streets last night, so there is a lot of garbage around from people sleeping outside, not necessarily damage, because they felt it was safer outside than inside their homes.
The Moroccans are very resilient people, so people are working, they are going back to their lives, but nobody has never lived an earthquake of such a magnitude. You're not in control of anything. You know, you're waiting for the worst to happen.